let's look at topic 8. This is the second one of our proofs topics that we're doing in this review series. Okay, we want to do our first proof here. You have a list of reasons that you can use that are like a ABC list. I'm going to go ahead and give you both answers, both the word and the letter that it would go with. So we are given some information here that A and B are parallel. So I'm going to go ahead and mark my notation on A and B that they're parallel. And we are also told that measure of angle 2 is 62 degrees. So I'm going to also mark that down. And we've noted that those are given. My next statement says that 1 and 2 equal 180 degrees. I can see that from my diagram that they are next to each other and make a line, and we call that a linear pair. If you were to look through your letters, that would be L that you're looking at. Okay. Our next statement now says that the measure of angle 1 plus 62 is going to give us 180. What we're doing here is we're taking measure of angle 2 and substituting 62 into it. So our reason there is substitution. And if you look that up on your chart, that is reason F. Okay. Moving on to line 4, we now have the measure of angle 1 equals 62. What we did, equals 118. What we did to get there was we actually subtracted 62 from both sides. When we do that, we're talking about the subtraction property of equality. And on your sheet, that would be reason B. Okay, moving on. We are now saying that angle 1 equals the same thing or is congruent to angle 5. If we go back to our diagram, we'll see that angle 1 and angle 5 are in the same position. That is what we call corresponding angles. And our theorem here would be that corresponding angles postulate. If you look on your sheet, that would be point S. If it helps, I can write out. Those are corresponding. Okay, moving on to step 6. This is what allows us to say that the angles are congruent to the measures are congruent is what is the definition of congruence. Okay, and on your sheet, that was reason P. Now we want to go from the 2 steps above it, 5 and 6, and end up with our statement measure of angle 5 equals 118. Sorry, it's not 5 and 6. We're actually going to use 4 and 6. This is confusing because we've always used 2 statements that are right in a row, but we're now going to use statement 4 and statement 6. And what we're going to link together is our measure of angle 1s, and we're going to get rid of those, and that's how we end up with measure of angle 5 equals 118 right there. So that was actually the transitive property. And that was reason I. Okay. So look at proof number 2. Same idea. We're given all the statements and we're going to give the reasons for it. So the first thing is what we're given, that the measure of angle 1 is 124. So I'm going to write that on my angle 1. And we're told the measure of angle 3 is 56. Our goal is to prove that A and B are parallel. So we're going to start with our statement number 2 where we say the measure of 1 and 2 is 180. We can say that because they form a linear pair. And looking on our sheet, that would be reason L. Now we can say that 124 plus the measure of angle 2 equals 180. If I look at this, the only difference I have here is angle 1 and 124. So what I'm really doing here is substituting in 124 for 1, and our reason becomes substitution. And that is F. Our sheet. Now we want to get from statement 3 to statement 4, and the only thing different is that we have subtracted 124 from both sides. So we got rid of our numbers here, left with measure of angle 2, and subtracted on the other side. So when we do that, that was the subtraction property. We're talking about an equal sign here, so it's POE, property of equality. The subtraction property is B on your sheet. Okay, so now we want to say that measure of angle 2 equals the measure of angle 3. We are going to do this confusingly again with the transitive property. It's confusing because our statements are not next to each other. These are the two statements that we're going to use. Okay, if we have angle 3 is 56 and angle 2 is 56, we're going to put those together, get rid of the 56, link those together, and say 2 is 3. Measure of 2 is 3. Transitive property. The transitive property is I on our sheet. Okay. If we go from the measure of the angles being the same to the angles being congruent, we're using the definition of congruence. Which is P. And lastly, we are now able to say that angle A is parallel to angle B because we know that angle 2 is now equivalent to angle 3. And again, when we prove things are parallel, we're going to be using a converse. In this case, it's the converse of the alternate exterior angles theorem. Alternate exterior angles, which is on our sheet UU. Proof number 3. We're given some information we want to put on our diagram. We know that the two sets of lines are parallel, and we also know that angle 10 is 100 degrees. Those are what we're given. Now we want to say that angle 10 is equivalent to angle 2. So if we look on our sheet here, our diagram, the reason we can say that is because they're corresponding. We can call it that corresponding angles postulate, write out corresponding, and we should translate it into our list that we're using, which is S. Now we want to say that 2 equals 8. We're going to have to look at different parallel lines this time. 2 equals 8 is true because they are alternate interiors. And our reason for that is T. Okay. Now we're looking at why we can say, from the two statements above it, why we can say 10 is the same thing as 8. We're doing that looking at the two statements in front of it and linking together something that's the same in both. When we do that, it's called transitive property. And we are calling that I. Okay. So step 5, we now want to say that from knowing the angles are congruent, being able to say that the measures are the same is what the definition of congruence is. And that is P. Okay. A couple more to look at. Now we can say that the measure of angle 8 is 100 degrees. Why? Because we're substituting. We're going to use one of the things we were given, which is the measure of angle 10 is 100. And now that we know that 10 and 8 are the same thing, we can substitute in 100 for the measure of angle 10, and that is how we get step 6, which is substitution. That would be F. Okay. The next one is asking us to look at the fact that the measure of angle 8 and the measure of angle 7 is 180. We need to look back at our diagram to see that. But 7 and 8 do make a straight line. And that's what we call a linear pair. We can use that linear pair postulate to say that they equal 180, which is reason L. Now we want to say that instead of 8, we want to use 100, which we can do by substituting in. We can change measure of 8 to 100, and we get our next step using substitution. Which is F. Okay, and our last step is to do what we're asked to prove, which is the measure of angle 7 is 80. And we got there by subtracting 100 from both sides. When we do that, we have the substitution property. Substitution, which is B.